the things that you also speak about in your book is about the terminology of Asori, which is, as we would know it, as the Arameans would know it, is the direct translation to the Arameans or the Syrian Christians. What is your perception of that definition of Asori, and how often is it? It's used here in Armenia, just to be clear. It's used here in Armenia to describe a certain group of people. And who are those people?
Well, here in Armenia we call Asori the followers of the Church of the East, or so-called Nestorian Syriacs, or Assyrians as they call themselves. This community originates in the first quarter of the 19th century, when Armenia became part of the Russian Empire, and the Christians of living in Iran, in the Urmia region, they were allowed to resettle in Armenia, and this is when several villages were established in Armenia around Yerevan, and these villages still exist, and these are the villages when we actually can hear the modern Aramaic dialect, or even the standard Aramaic dialect. And Armenia was one of the very few countries in the world in which this language was included in the school curricula. And Armenia has the longest uninterrupted history of teaching of this language in the schools. So if you go to this school, to the villages like the Dvin Asori village, you can visit the school and see the children learning their language, and they learn it during all their time at school, a full 12 years curriculum, which is a unique experience here in Armenia in teaching modern Aramaic language, or modern Assyrian as they call it sometimes.
But the term, because of course we've just been here in Armenia at the Global Forum for the Crime Against Genocide, and during the whole conference basically there was a reference to the Aramean genocide, the Syriac genocide, as being an Assyrian. They kept on referring to Assyrianism, Assyrian. Now, there seems to be a confusion of terminology, doesn't there? Because Asori does not mean Assyrian.
Well, in the Armenian languages there is very established terminology which goes back to at least 5th century. And in the Armenian historians, medieval historians and modern historians, they're very clearly distinguished between Asori and Asorestans'i. Asori being the Armenian equivalent of the classical Syriac term Suriaya, which was adopted after the Arameans, this history, they adopted Christianity, and since the name Aramean became equivalent to pagan, so they switched to Suriaya. And in Armenian tradition, the Asori was the equivalent of Suriaya. When we read our medieval historians like Moses of Koren, it becomes very obvious that for him existed two separate peoples, Syriacs, whom we call Asori, and ancient Assyrians were called Asorestants'i. And this is the tradition that exists in Armenian science, historical science up to these days. If you take the Armenian encyclopedia and you read the article about the Asoris, the first line that says, the Asoris are the descendants of Arameans. Or if you read, for example, we have a very interesting book on Armenian Syriac cultural exchanges by Haik Melkonian, very famous historian, very famous book. He says the same thing, that Asoris are part of the Aramean people. So in Armenia, in Armenian terminology, there is no confusion. Of course, other people in the streets may confuse Asori with Asorestans'i because sound alike. But this distinction exists in our historiography.
And I think that the former president of Armenia was also a historian and also studied Aramaic history and Syriac history as well.
He was the first president of independent Armenia, world-renowned scholar in Armenian culture and Armenian Syriac cultural interactions. He has a book, many articles, and he also uses the same approach in terminology, because that's, let me repeat it, it's established in our scientific or historic terminology.
But there still seems to be some confusion, doesn't there, in the modern society that you refer to, and something clearly needs to be done, because there seems to be a mistaken translation somewhere, because what you're saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're saying is that all scholars agree and all historians of worth agree that Asori means Aramean Syriacs. It does not mean Assyrian. But it
Yes,
seems to be
in
a-
Armenian tradition, Asori is the equivalent of Suriaya.
Yeah.
Like we call Marafrem Suriaya, it's called Surp Yeprem Asori, or Saint Yeprem, the Syriac that used the modern version of the world.
Okay.